Okay, hello. I'm Brenda Warren. I'm president of the Reading League Vermont, and we're really glad to see you here today. Before we get started, I want to request that you please use the chat only for questions so we can find them more easily at the end when we have time to have our speaker answer them. And let me introduce our speaker. He's Dr. Stephen Graham. He's a Regents and the Warner Professor in the Division of Leadership and Innovation in Teachers College. For 47 years, he has studied how writing develops, how to teach it effectively, and how writing can be used to support reading and learning. His research typically involves developing writers and students with special needs in both elementary and secondary schools, with much of it conducted in urban school classrooms. Dr. Graham is a prolific writer. He's the former editor of many journals, including Exceptional Children, Contemporary Educational Psychology, Journal of Writing Research, Focus on Exceptional Children, and Journal of Education Psychology. He also has co-authored the Handbook of Writing Research, Handbook of Learning Disabilities, APA Handbook of Educational Psychology, Writing Better, Powerful Writing Strategies for All Students, and Making the Writing Process Work. Additionally, he is the author of three influential Carnegie Corporation reports, Writing Next, Writing to Read, and Informing Writing. So I'm very excited to hear him. He obviously has been doing this for many years. He will be presenting an overview of effective K-12 writing instruction from handwriting to writing genres, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Graham.
Thank you for that very nice introduction. So I always like to start by, I'm not give me a second, make sure my slides will advance. There we go. I won't come back to this, but I like to give people a sense of the evidence for where the recommendations or points that I'm going to make come from. So over, say the last 10, 15 years, we've conducted a large number of meta-analysis, and all told for first grade or kindergarten to 12th grade, they involve about 1,000 writing intervention studies where there's either a control group and a treatment group, although for about 100 of those studies, we also looked at single case design studies, which also allow you to make causal interpretations. And mostly they're done with kids with special needs. And we've also done what's called a meta-synthesis, taking a look at case studies of really effective literacy teachers to see what they do in writing. And so there's actually quite a bit of data to draw upon for the recommendations that I'd like to share with you in terms of developing a strong kind of evidence-based writing program, at least at this point, what we know. I'll share outcomes when they're appropriate, but won't dwell on those. And I put those in percentiles so that if, let's say I talk about something like teaching handwriting or teaching spelling, you might see a percentile point. And that will mean if you had a kid that was at the 50th percentile, if it says 17 percentile, that means you would expect about them to move from the 50th to the 67th percentile. Now, there's always a caution here, and that is that those percentiles or whatever, whether it was effect sizes or something else I present, those are based on averages. So there's a range. You know, some kids respond even better. Some kids respond not quite as well. The other thing to keep in mind, and this will be my last caution, is that, you know, research studies often have more resources ingrained in them than you'll have in your classroom. And so what we try to do is not make any statements unless there's a number of classrooms with which our research studies where this has been tried out and worked. But, you know, just because it worked in a research study doesn't guarantee it's going to work in your classroom. So there's always a buyer beware caution. Just like when you go to the doctor and they prescribe something to you, let's say you're taking some medication, they're going to be encouraging you to get back to them if it's not working, or if there's side effects that are, you know, ones that you really don't want to have. So it's a similar kind of thing. These things generally work, but they don't work in all situations with all kids. And so, like all academics, I always hedge my bets. Okay, so I'm going to state 5 things that I think are critical to developing effective writing program. Doesn't matter who we're talking about. And one of those, the first one I'm going to talk about from an empirical basis, is the weakest one, but it'd be foolish to leave it out. We want kids to write, and we want them to write frequently. And sometimes they're writing short pieces, and sometimes they need to be writing extended pieces. Now, the reason I say that it's the weakest of the things that I'll talk about is that in recent years, when we've looked at the effects of just increasing how much time students write, we're not seeing an effect for elementary students or secondary students in terms of improving their overall quality of writing. In fact, we did a study in Norway, and this is an embarrassment in a way. We spent 2 years with kids where teachers helped us develop what they thought would be interesting and useful and audience-based writing activities that they implemented over a 2 year period in first and second grade. And compared to a business as usual, just kind of doing whatever they did, we didn't do any better. And so just increasing how much students write doesn't necessarily mean they're going to become better writers. I would say it's a necessary but not sufficient condition. Now, with that said, I will also say, because I'm going to talk about this later, when you write about stuff that you read, reading comprehension of that material goes up. When you write about stuff you're learning in the classroom, comprehension and remembrance of that material goes up as well. So don't get me wrong. I'm just saying increasing writing or just having a program where kids write, it's not enough. But there are some things that we can say. One of those is that in terms of action steps, this is a recommendation from the What Works Clearinghouse Guide for Elementary Writing that I was chair of. And this is, again, not an evidence-based thing, but for the teachers and experts that participated in this What Works Clearinghouse Guide, we all agreed that we should be spending about an hour a day in terms of teaching writing. And by that, way of thinking about it, kids need to write at least 30 minutes a day and have about 30 minutes of instruction. Now, of course, that will differ depending on the grade level and differ depending upon the kid. And not all that writing has to be done during language arts time, because we want kids to write during science, social studies, even math, and other subject areas. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Writing can be a very powerful tool for learning, and we want to take advantage of that. Another thing, and you will see a percentile jump point here, and you'll recognize many of these things as being part of the process approach to writing or writer's workshop. So if you implement a writer's workshop, typically there's a positive effect on writing quality. So you get about a 16 percentile point jump. But in terms of what looks really important there is that we give students extended opportunities for writing. They engage in cycles of planning, translating, and reviewing. They write as often for real purposes and real audiences. And there's a stress on personal responsibility and ownership for students in their writing. Now, when I mention this, what is going to be missing from here is a point that I'm going to talk about later. Typically in writer's workshop or process approaches to writing, there's not much of a strong emphasis on systematically teaching writing skills, knowledge, or process. Often what happens is as it seems that students need instruction in something as you're engaging in these cycles, we provide small mini lessons. Nothing wrong with the mini lessons. They can be very effective, but they may not be enough, and for many kids are not enough to get them over the hump, so to speak, like learning to be more strategic in terms of planning or revising or evaluating their writing. And we'll come to that a little bit later, or developing the basic foundational skills that can interfere with these other processes of planning, translating, and reviewing. A second thing, and this follows directly on the right, because when we support kids as they write, guess what? We get a boost in the quality of their writing. So again, writing's sufficient, but if you want to make it more powerful, you put in supports that help them do better as they write. So what are some of those evidence-based supports that we know work? Well, if you were to say to me, what's the easiest thing you can do? It's to set clear and specific goals for what you're expecting students to achieve with their writing. Now, this can also go the other way. Kids can set goals of their own for what they plan to do in their writing, set plans for how to do it, monitor it, and make revisions if they don't. But look at that percentile point jump. This takes very little time and some thought on your part, and you get that kind of jump in writing quality. That's incredible. So what kind of goals am I talking about? So let's say that you have a couple of kids in your classroom who don't produce very much text, okay, when they write. And then you're asking them to revise. And what often happens with kids who tend to produce little text, they're revising is kind of what I call Sars's approach, that cleaning the window here, trying to change spelling or a few words there, maybe adding a phrase here, but it's pretty minimal. Most of it tends to focus in on mechanics. So if I wanted kids to be more substantively oriented in terms of doing this, I might just set for a particular kid, what I'd like for you to do when you revise this is to add 3 new ideas to it. So that shifts the focus. That doesn't mean they won't do mechanical revisions, but it shifts the focus to something that, but I said 50 things they couldn't do it, but 3, they're likely to be able to do that. As an example of this in a slightly different way, in working with fifth grade kids who had been identified as having a learning disability, we asked them at the start of our study to write a story and then revise it. And then during the course of what we'll call the intervention here, we gave them a choice of goals they could do. So they could write a story, and when they revise, they would choose between adding a new character, setting it in a different place, changing the time. But we give them 3 or 4 options to choose from, and we did that across 3 different write and revise sessions. They couldn't choose the same goal each time. And then we came back and we took a look. We didn't give them a goal. We said write and revise. And so here's what we found is that for most of the kids, what happened is when they had chosen a goal to add, say, a character, they increased the length and quality of their text. And when we didn't have the goal in place at the final point, they'd internalized what we were looking for well enough that there are also improvements in their revising, their quality of writing, and the output. Now, here's always the kicker. There's always some kids who will beat you at your game. So we had 2 kids in this study, and they did basically the same thing. Like when asked to write, when they picked a goal to add a character, they had their story. They went in and did their thesaurus approach, cleaning up a little here and there. And then at the end of the story, they wrote, oh, and by the way, John was in the study. I mean, in the story. So, they figured out a way where they didn't have to do much, but they could add John in. And that really wasn't our intent. Now, obviously, if this was a classroom thing, then we would have had a conference and say, this isn't exactly what we're looking for. We want you to integrate John in here a little bit better. But it does illustrate that any approach that you take, some kids will find a way to get around that approach. And so, we want to always try to be a little bit smarter on how we approach these things. Um, Pre-writing activities. So if you're teaching writing, I suspect you're already doing this. Having kids read for information to include in their text, having them talk to each other about the topic in advance, or having them use things like a graphic organizer where they generate their ideas and organize them. If you engage kids in pre-writing activities, whether it's inquiry-based or whether it's something like a graphic organizer, there's a pretty strong jump in writing quality. Now, that doesn't mean you just hand them a graphic organizer and say, fill this out. It's better if you model how to do that and then, make sure that they understand what they're doing so that you give an example and then they apply it themselves and you give assistance as needed. Another way that we can support students as they write is through feedback. And so, I've got this broken down in 2 ways. I could have broken it down in several others. There's teacher, there's peer, there's self, and now there's computer feedback. And we're starting to find that computer feedback is good enough that it can make a difference in the quality of students' writing. But we do know that when peers and teachers give give students in the classroom or give their peers feedback, there's a pretty good jump in quality. Now, the self-assessment I'll come to in a second. In terms of peer feedback, it's really important that we set up a system for doing that. And I'm just going to tell another story that kind of illustrates a failure on my part, like it kind of did with the goal setting thing. The first time we tried peer feedback, I was meeting with two kids with learning disabilities after school in fifth and sixth grade when elementary school still used to go to sixth grade. And I had each of them write a story about what they did. This is going to sound really funky, but over their Christmas break, that kind of old thing that we never suggest you do, but I asked them to do it because they'd just come back from Christmas break. And so the one kid, the young lady, there's a young girl and a young boy. She wrote her story, and I said, because it was a little difficult to read, I made a copy for the young boy, and the girl read her story to the young boy. And, I asked the boy, give her some feedback. And that was all I said. Really dumb. Okay. And the reason it was dumb was the first thing he said is, that stunk. And so the girl got upset, threw a paper on the floor, and, it's after school, marched out into the hallway. So I took, if you want to think of it this way, I took my little black bag and went home with my, tail tucked between my legs and thought about how stupid I'd been in terms of doing this. So I went back 2 days later and I talked to the young lady and I said, I apologized to her. And I said, I could have made this more organized. And so we talked about how we'd do this and what she would do in giving the feedback. The young man would read her story. She would say something positive. She'd take the paper, and any place that she didn't understand what was going on, she'd put a question mark. And any place where she thought, because neither of these kids wrote a lot, that more detail was needed, she'd give a carrot. And then what we did was we practiced how to give feedback. So in this case, we gave oral feedback because all we have are small marks on the paper. It could have been, we could have done it with comments or something, but in this particular case, this is the way we approached it. And so when the young boy came back into the room, she shared her feedback. It went great. She said, I also said, say 2 or 3 positive things to start. And then, you don't have to get everything in here, but you want to point out the places that you're concerned about and do it in a conversational thing. And so this kid had taken a trip to Vermont for skiing, and her first question was, I didn't quite understand how you got to Vermont. And, he was able to explain. And then we made it clear that, you have to decide which of this feedback is going to help you improve your papers, giving your intention and your goals for it. And so we took that and we changed some of the things that we use. We obviously added more than a question mark and a carrot, but basically we set up a structure like that so kids could give feedback to each other. And I think that's particularly important. In terms of self-assessment, what's critical here is also that you teach kids how to self-assess whatever you're having them assess. It actually may not make that big a difference if they get the same score that you might. They don't have to be as accurate as you might be. Just the act of self-assessment can improve students' writing. And then I'd like to make a couple caveats on feedback. Now, these are not evidence-based, but this is based on my experience over time. Too much feedback can be debilitating. So we act like we're going to change the whole world every time we give feedback. We don't have to have a perfect paper unless it's something that's, say, going up on the board or is going to be published in some way in something. But my suggestion here is that you should always celebrate students' accomplishments and pick 2 or 3 things that you're giving feedback on that you think are most important. And so that what you're doing is you're thinking about this is the long march instead of the short march. If you give too much, it's overwhelming to kids. But if you look at it as the long march, giving some feedback now, it may be the same feedback in the next paper. And then as those areas of issues are addressed, then you bring new feedback issues in, but you're pushing the student forward in a sense, instead of trying to do everything at one time. Because simply put, I think it's too much. Another thing is that sometimes we give feedback and kids can't do it. They don't have the skills. We assume if we give feedback, we have a comment that they can take that feedback and actually make their paper better in some way. And in many studies that we've done in terms of students revising, we found that when we give feedback, sometimes the revisions are worse than what we had there to begin with. And so there are times when you get feedback, kids are going to need instruction. So, if you say to kids, well, you've got too many of the same sentences, they may not know what to do with that. You may need to model or illustrate or use something like sentence combining to illustrate how to create more complex sentences. And the other thing that we see that happens is that feedback is typically treated as a one-time event for each paper. So I did a workshop in Texas one time with about 500 teachers focusing on revising. And I had them break up in groups, and they had a paper for a kid that who had learning disabilities and with learning disabilities. And I asked them to think about in their 2 or 3 group what kind of feedback they were going to give and how they would do that. And they had great suggestions. And so about 30 minutes after that, I gave them another paper written a week later by the same kid. Now, as you might expect, a lot of the same issues were still there. And only 2 teachers, one pod out of all these 500 teachers, actually, when we came back and talked about this, had connected both of those writing pieces. So we want to think about this as kind of the long view again, is that we look for patterns that exist across papers. When students do something, we gave them feedback in one paper, and in the next paper, that problem has disappeared. We want to let them know that because we want them to keep doing that. And if we keep seeing a problem occur, then that would suggest point 3 here. We need to provide some instruction. So again, those are not evidence-based. Those are more based on my practice in working with kids. Um, Also, we want to have kids work together to plan, draft, revise, and edit. Now, you don't have to do all of those, but when we have kids work together to plan or do any of these, we get a nice jump in writing quality. But again, think about that example that I gave with peer revising. It needs to be structured, and you need to think about who will work with whom. Sometimes you put a kid who's really a strong writer with a kid who's not as strong, and the strong writer just takes over and does everything. That doesn't help the kid who's not the strong writer very much. So, we want to kind of monitor how things are working out. Sometimes we have really strong writers who are great at sharing the role, and sometimes we don't. We want to support students with 21st century writing tools. I now start to have a little bit of hesitation about this. If somebody wants to ask my opinion about AI, which is probably in the middle of the road, I have certain things I think we need to put into place to make sure that it doesn't minimize thinking and it doesn't minimize writing instruction. I'd be glad to point that out. But this really focuses on word processing and what I'd call word processing plus programs. So we have some word processing programs that might have inspiration, which is a planning program built into them, or they give feedback through an automated writing evaluation system. So we get about an 18 percentile point jump in writing quality when that's compared to kids writing by hand. And it's pretty easy to see why that might be the case. When you're on a word processor, if you type fairly well, you can go faster, you can move things around, you can change them more easily. They have spell checkers, they have grammar checkers, and they can have other tools to them. I will say though, in the last meta-analysis that we did at the secondary level, we're working on a large one now at the elementary, there was a drop in the effects of word processing on students' writing. I think the reason for this large of a jump that we have here is that when word processing first came out, there were more studies on it, and kids were really excited to do it because it was something different. It was motivating, and we saw improvements in students' motivation for writing. What we're seeing is smaller jumps for moving to off of paper and pencil to word processing because it's just basically another writing tool now. So that would be, I don't think it has as strong effects as it once did. So those were some of the ways in which we can support students as writers, but that is not enough. They need to write, we need to support them, but we need to teach as well. And in terms of the teaching, we have quite a bit of evidence here. Now, you have to be selective about what you teach because this is a really complex process and there's a lot that could be taught. So I'm going to share with you what I think the most important things to focus our attention in are. One is that think about that process writing approach where I said kids are engaged in cycles of planning, drafting, revising, and editing, you have to have some skills at planning. You have to have some strategies or techniques for carrying out the planning process, the revising process, and the editing process. And quite frankly, just because most of the things that have been most effective in terms of teaching kids, say, planning strategies, have been genre specific. Now, you could take something like brainstorming, which you might teach a kid in kindergarten or first grade, and that's a general strategy, and that's useful across our whole lives in all kinds of ways. But if you want students to write a good story, then they need to plan with the aspects of stories in mind. Same thing with writing a persuasive text. We use different building elements to do that. And so I'll give kind of an illustration in a little bit. As we teach kids strategies, and those can range like from the general things like brainstorming or semantic webs, to some kind of story writing strategy or an argumentative writing strategy or an informative, we want to be sure that students can look at the situation we're asking them to be in terms of writing, whether it's a prompt given by your district, whether it's something you're doing in a classroom, to think about what tools that they already know to bring to this. But I want you to look at that percentile jump. That's a 35 percentile point jump. There's nothing that I can recommend in terms of improving writing quality more than this. Now, that doesn't mean that their handwriting is going to get better, their sentence construction is going to get better. But what happens with these strategies is ideation and organization tend to get better. So in terms of thinking about this, I'm going to skip this slide because I've already said this, and I'm going to skip that one. But in terms of teaching strategies, the very basics that we want to be sure of is, one, students know what the purpose of the strategy is. I mean, that sounds crazy, right? But I have been in classrooms where something's introduced and there's no explanation of when or where you use it. We want to be sure that and students need to understand how it works. We want to model the strategy. And when I say model, for me, model means thinking out loud, but engaging students in the process to help me. So if I'm modeling a strategy on how to generate a plan for a persuasive text, I might say, I have to write a text about whether uh, our school should have kids wear uniforms. Let's say it's something like that. And so I have to decide which, in this case, I need to decide, which point of view I want to support. And I might get some input from kids about that, and we might decide together. But I'm starting them down that step. And then I need to think of reasons that are going to be, that are going to convince my reader of this. And so again, they may help me generate this so that they're not sitting there like a bump on a log. And so then I might do this more than once where they're helping me, but I'm starting to let them take more control. Then I have them do the strategy together a couple of times. And as soon as I think they can do that, they go to independence. And I want them to be able to do this without me there. So what does a strategy like this look like? So I'm going to share with you a strategy that we've used with fourth grade on up. And it's actually been used with college students. I think it's a little simple for college students, but sometimes it's been used in foreign language studies there. The basic idea was this: we have this mnemonic stop. And the idea behind that is that before you write, you stop. It's just a reminder you want to plan. And so then what we did is we asked kids, this is for persuasive writing. We wanted them to think about all the sides of an argument and generate support for each side of those. So they're looking at each side. And that can be done individually. It can be done in a small group. It can be done as a whole class. It can be done after reading materials. But you've got to have something to write about. And the idea was that you start exploring those ideas as part of the planning process. The next step was to take a side. Now, I have to be frank here. My hope was that, kids would look at these, their various viewpoints, and that some of them might change the side that they would have initially taken. Didn't happen very often, but it did help them when we got to the next step, which was to organize your ideas. This is the basic plan. We'd have them say, okay, I picked this side that I'm going to defend. Now I'll go through the points I've made, and if other ones come up, that's fine while I'm doing this, but I'm going to pick the ones I think I most need to convince my reader of. And I'd put a star by 3 to 5 of those. There's no magic number. And then I'd look at the other side of the argument. Which things do I most need to address to make a strong argument that this is right. And so they would star those, and then they would number how they were gonna address them. And then in any plan that we make, we encourage kids to plan and say more. And by that, what we often found was when we were teaching these teaching planning strategies, if we didn't have that as a step in the process, students would stop any planning. That plan ended up being their paper, and that's not what we're after. We want kids to plan before and as they write, and even after they write, when they're revising. If new ideas come up, just like really good writers, they'll bring those into play. And so, the reason I said fourth grade on up is typically you're not dealing with both sides of the argument before then, although some kids could easily do that. But this would be an example of a strategy. It's for argumentative writing only. If I was doing informative writing, it would be a different strategy. If I was doing story writing, I would be focused in on setting an episode, kind of who, when, where, what's the main character's goal, what happens, etc., so that I'm building a story. But you can see basic building blocks of an argumentative or persuasive text here, and we're using those to help kids generate and organize information. We also want to teach sentence construction. Now, when you look at Common Core state standards, which most of you, I don't know what Vermont did. If like Arizona, where I live, you'd have thought Common Core state standards were generated in Hades, so to speak, because immediately Arizona went about, it's a pretty conservative state, of renaming them the Arizona state standards, made virtually no changes in them. But they got rid of Common Core as a the nomenclature around it. But one of the things that didn't happen in Common Core is they didn't talk about sentence construction. And I'd say about 90% of your time when you're writing is focused in on taking the ideas that you have and putting those into appropriate phrases, sentences that convey your intended meaning, that make sense to the reader and are grammatically correct. And so this is something that we need to provide students with instruction is. Now you'll notice it says 19 percentile point jump here. That's writing quality. There's also improvement in sentence construction, and there's an improvement in reading fluency when you do this. And so the most common approach for doing this that we have some evidence on is sentence combining. And so this would be an example. What we would do is we would have two kernel sentences or smaller sentences that can be combined together. And we would model how to do this. And you see the but there, that means you have to use the word but. So in this particular case, a teacher would model what they left out, what they leave in, speaking out loud, and construct a sentence. Now, often sentences can be constructed more than one way. So if I did something like the dog is big and the dog is black, well, I could construct that as the dog is big and black, the black dog is big. So there's different ways that they can be combined. But the idea is that you model several of the kind of structures that you want. Students then work together to combine sentences of the same structure. They work independently, and then they go and write something using those sentences or revise something. We want to have them put it back into play in their writing. That step is often missing, and we're sometimes left wondering, well, we weren't effective at this because they didn't do it when they wrote. Well, we didn't give them a chance to do so. So we want to be sure to do that. We also, I'm going to pass this up because I kind of said that already. When we talk about reading, we often talk about the importance of vocabulary. Well, if you take a look at teachers' evaluation of students' writing, the thing that counts for the most variability, or maybe a different way of presenting this, the best predictor of the quality of students' writing is the vocabulary they use. And so how do we help students become more proficient in their use of vocabulary? Well, we can take what's the common reading approach, and we teach a lot of tier 2 words, and that's great because reading programs typically do this for us. But in some instances, we can teach genre vocabulary words, like we did a study on a mystery unit, where we taught kids vocabulary related to mystery, like what's a red herring, what's a clue, etc. Now they typically knew that. And what we found is that those kind of pieces of vocabulary brought with them information about what the characteristics of a mystery is. And so kids' mysteries got better as a result. Or if we're working in science and we're working on something in outer space and we want kids to write about that, we can teach content words related to outer space. All of those have a positive effect on students' writing quality. Also, very importantly, particularly in the first three grades and beyond for some kids, we want to teach handwriting, spelling, and typing. Now, look, what's interesting here is there's a 21 percentile point jump when we do this in writing quality. Kids' handwriting fluency gets better, kids' legibility gets better, their spelling gets better. And if we're teaching spelling, at least one of the meta-analysis we've done suggests that word reading gets better and reading comprehension gets better and really close on reading fluency. I think if there had been a few more studies, we'd have probably found significance there as well. And so, you know, the reason why this is important, and let me just give a really practical example of this. All of us have been in a situation like, say, with handwriting, our hand's not fast enough to keep up with our mind. Now, if you're if you're in second grade and you're writing 15 letters per minute, that's really difficult. So if you want to test this out, use your non-dominant hand to write, and we can make it harder by saying every fourth word, spell it backwards, and see what that does to your writing. It interferes with, you know, you lose ideas that you're holding in working memory, they slip away, maybe you get them back, but it's kind of like chopping up, you know, it's being in hyperspace and you're going along, and all of a sudden you got to stop to spell a word. And you come out of hyperspace and whatever you were holding in working memory may slip away. And so what we find is that when we teach these things, kids get better, you know, I didn't mention this, but also for spelling, often get better at word choice and often get better at sentence construction because these things are not interfering with the process of constructing sentences, are not interfering with the processes of holding ideas in your working memory and the next thing you want to say. And so it's really important we master these where kids are fluent with these as soon as possible. We also want to teach kids about the different aspects of the types of texts they're going to write. So often we do this with reading. We'll look at something like a story. We'll analyze with kids, you know, what makes this a good story, and we'll focus in on the basic parts. Like I said before, the who, when, where, you know, what's the main character want to do if we want to use really simple terminology for this. And we get them where they can identify those basic parts in their story, and then we encourage them to make sure their story has those basic parts as well. We can do the same thing by having students emulate model text where they analyze, say, a persuasive text to see what the parts are, and we ask them to emulate it. In both cases, we're really doing much the same thing. Now, I want to take a look and see how I'm doing on time. I'm still okay. So these last parts will go a little bit quicker. We want to connect students writing with learning and writing with reading. And so when we use writing to support understanding of what is read, we get an 18 percentile point jump in reading comprehension. When we connect writing and reading instruction, by that, what I'm talking about is if you have a program and 60% of the time is spent on either reading or writing and 40% on the other, we get better gains than if you know, 90% spent reading. I don't know that there's ever a time that 90% spent on writing and 10% spent on reading. But if we balance the inclusion of these two things in our literacy program, it gets better. And when we use writing to support learning in science, social studies, and math, students understand that material better and retain it better. So we want to take advantage of that power. And I'm going to take a skip over that. And I want to mention the last thing, and that is, so far I've said we need to write, we need to support students as writers, we need to teach them critical skills, foundational skills, strategies, and knowledge. We need to connect writing, reading, and learning more tightly together. And we want to create a classroom environment in which kids can thrive. And this comes from the study of those exceptional literacy teachers. We want to make sure that students feel free to take risk. So if you're teaching something like sentence combining, you know, that, you know, they can be combined in different ways. You combine sentences in your ideas or sentences in your text in different ways. That involves some risk taking. Sometimes that works out, sometimes it doesn't. Some of the older studies taking a look at sentence construction found that when, say, middle school students were taught new sentence skills, they tended to make more errors initially until they became more comfortable and facile with those things. So if you're not free to take risk, then you can't learn from your errors. We want to be sure that their work, and I really want to emphasize effort, are appreciated and that writing is valued. So what are some of the things that we can do to make sure this happens? I would encourage, like the National Writing Project does, is that for teachers to set up a community in their classroom, and they're part of that writing community. They write and they share their writing with kids. They get feedback from it. So they're part of that learning community. We want to give students choice. Now, I'm always a little hesitant on this one. We looked at choice. Everybody likes choice. I love choice, but choice is a lot more complicated than we often think. Some kids have trouble making choices. And so by choice in that case, we might say, okay, if we have a kid with, you can pick the topic that you want to, and we have a kid who can't pick a topic, then we provide three topics and let them choose one of them instead of them kind of floundering around. My daughter used to do this. She could spend 3 days picking a topic because she wanted to avoid writing. The other thing is that sometimes it's good to write against the grain. We did a study in which we looked at students' choice, and then we had them write in the opposite of that on persuasive writing. And some of the kids came back and said they learned more by, dealing with the other side of the argument than the one that they already supported. So, you can look at this in multiple ways. We want to be sure to praise students' efforts and accomplishments. We want to be real about this because kids are great at, figuring out when BS happens. We want to write for real purposes. We want to publish students' writing and extend the community. We want to set realistic goals for students, and these can differ for individual students, but they need to be challenging, but not so difficult that there's no chance they can achieve them. We want we want to create a classroom where students are encouraged to try hard, believe that what we're teaching them helps them to write well. The way that we approach this in much of our work is that we have students graph their progress where, they can see their success. And then when we conference with them, we talk about why that's the case with them. And what we're focusing on is their hard work and using what is being taught. We want to develop classroom routines, which we've already talked about. And we want to be sure for kids who find writing more challenging that we can adapt assignments and instruction so they're appropriate to students' interests and needs. Sometimes I run into situations where if I adapt anything, then that's sending the wrong message. And I don't think that's the case because our kids come in with so much varying needs at each grade level, as you already know if you teach. If you're teaching a second grade classroom, you're going to have 3 or 4 grade levels of difference in terms of students' capabilities. So that's it for me. So we have a little bit of time for questions. And thank you very much for sharing some time with me.
Excellent.
Actually, we have more time than I thought, I think. Let me take a look back at my clock. Yeah, that's great. So whatever you want to ask, I'm good. We got about 15 minutes or so.
I will begin. Um, One question that came in from the chat is, how do I support a sixth grader with writing who is still struggling with transcription? The district does not offer testing for dysgraphia, and he tested possible risks for dyslexia. However, he does not qualify for transcribing accommodations because he makes average grade. He's very intelligent, but struggles with putting ideas on paper.
Okay. So my daughter was very similar in
I
terms of
think it's
this.
low. So maybe
Somebody's
Somebody's got their audio
yeah,
on.
audio on. So my daughter, I'm gonna have to go back a little bit before sixth grade, but my daughter used to form a U like up, back down to the baseline, up, all the way back around and then down. And so all of her letters were kind of like that. And it was painful watching her write. And in her case, she also, even in fourth grade, she couldn't spell H-E-R-E correctly. Um, and as much as dictation is a possible solution, because what you see even through adulthood, when people dictate versus they write, they produce more text. Now, it doesn't mean it's necessarily better text, but it's also not worse text. It's just easier to produce. Um, the only difference is sometimes with kids with learning disabilities and kids in the very earlier grades, dictation will yield larger effects. So, that was the solution her first grade teacher had. But she said, oh, but I can't go around dictating for her all the time. And this was a Quaker school in Maryland, and, they had limited resources. And she's right, she couldn't do that. And that wasn't going to, at that point in time, look like a viable option. Now, I don't know about the sixth grader that you're talking about, but my daughter's fingers could fly across a keyboard. And so what we did, now we could afford this, so not everybody can. We bought, a smaller keyboard, more like the, hands of little kids for her to use at school. And she's never liked writing, but she's smart and she has good ideas. And by the time she was in seventh grade, she won the writing competition for their seventh grade classroom. She moved to a different kind of school that had competitions and stuff like that. Um, and so for her, it was getting past this transcription part. Now, if a computer isn't a possibility, there's some other options, and one is speech to text. Now, there was a time that I wouldn't even mention it because you used to have to say the word, pause, say another word. But look around, speech to text everywhere. It's the most common form of writing that exists in the US today and maybe the world. We're constantly speaking into our phones and it's transcribing it into text for us. Okay. So that might be a possibility if your school will allow that. But every kind of suggestion I could make, you want to be as smart as possible because they come with complications. So, what would be the complication with speech to text? Complication is that we tend to treat writing when we use speech to text like we do speaking. We speak extemporaneously off the top of our heads, so to speak. I'm not saying that writing is more complex than speech. Depends on the situation. I can have a speech that can be very complex and writing that can be very simple. But generally, if what you're doing is you're just saying the next thing that comes to your mind, that's not going to create very sophisticated writing. So there was a study that was done, and forgive me for going on so long on this, in the 1950s or 40s, somewhere in there, where they interviewed expert dictators. Now, I'm not talking about Saddam Hussein. They interviewed people who used to use dictaphones in the world of business and been using them for a long time. And what they found is that they spent 60% of their composing time planning before they actually dictated what they were going to say. So we tried this out in a study, slightly different thing. We didn't use a dictaphone, but we had somebody who would take the notes and we taught kids how to plan before writing a persuasive text. And then they could generate that text orally. And we compared that against doing it by hand. And what we found was that it was like a double boost. If you combined the dictation part for your, knowing how to plan and dictating your plan and dictating your composition, it was double what any of the other conditions were in terms of improvement for writing quality for kids, in this case, who struggle with writing or kids with learning disabilities for the most part. So, there are some options out there. Um, it's if you've got a kid who isn't making progress by sixth grade in terms of this, I'm not saying they can't make progress, but it may be time to start looking for some alternative options if possible.
Related to that question, someone asked about establishing guidance or a measure like Hasbrook and Tyndale have for reading fluency for writing fluency, or some thoughts on why writing and spelling fluencies remain largely ignored as a critical component of writing,
Okay.
related to what you were just
Yeah,
discussing.
I'm glad that the last part of that question came in because it makes the question more complex and nuanced. Okay, so you can think of fluency with writing in multiple ways. One is just, if you're composing something, how many words per minute do you compose? Okay, but you can also think about this in terms of a handwriting fluency. And so what you typically see in handwriting fluency is, we don't have great normative data on this in the US. I'm going to mention a study that Virginia Berninger and I did in Washington State, where we had 100 kids at each grade level, 50 girls, 50 boys, and it went up through grade 9. And what we found was, in first grade, kids wrote about 15 words per minute on average, or a little bit more, maybe 19, somewhere in there. Boys were slower at this than girls. Girls were more advanced. And every grade level, kids advanced about 10 letters per minute. And so that started to kind of fade off around ninth grade. And they were kind of hitting what we'd expect for adults to do. And most of that fluency develops, you need to, you can't do a letter U like my daughter did and expect to be fluent. But most fluency for something like handwriting fluency develops through actual writing. We teach students an efficient way of producing letters initially by modeling, giving them some practice. And then, as they write over time, they become more fluent. It's not dissimilar from reading. The more you read, the more fluent you tend to be. And, we use different ways of upping or amping that fluency for kids who struggle with that. Um, Spelling is kind of a similar thing, but we want spelling we don't want to think about spelling, right? So if you have to stop and think about spelling, it's that coming out of hyperspace thing that I mentioned before. And so the way that we tend to think about that is, how many words you misspell. So we see some kids with learning disabilities, for example, have been identified with learning disabilities. 1 out of every 4 words in fourth and fifth grade is misspelled. That's really slows you down. And then you have this kind of general, how many words do you write, in 10 minutes or 5 minutes when you're composing text? That one's the trickiest one of all for me. And the reason for that is that works pretty well is if you're kind of going with one idea stimulates the next, stimulates the next, stimulates the next. I'm not sure that that's great writing though. I don't know about you guys. I pause and think when I write. Now, on the other hand, for kids, if they can produce text fairly fluently, then that's probably a good proxy for their overall abilities to write. And so the question that you ask is complex because there's different ways of kind of looking at it. And it's complex and nuanced because we don't have adequate measures of this. Like in reading fluency, we have a pretty good idea of what we expect kids to be able to do in second, third, and fourth grade. And it's not quite as complicated as writing, where, pausing isn't necessarily a bad thing if I'm thinking about how to structure this part of the sentence, or I'm thinking about my next idea and how I'm going to say it, or a new idea has occurred to me. Those things don't happen in reading, and so it makes reading fluency a little bit better. I tend to like handwriting fluency as a pretty good proxy, but I also think probably for the first 3, 4, 5, 6 grades, how many words you write per minute is not a bad proxy for overall writing capabilities. So I'm sorry I gave such a long and professorial kind of comment or response to that, but it is one that I haven't fully come to grips with myself in terms of, what would be best here, because with the overall how many words you write per minute when you're writing a story, it could go either way.
Another person asked, they're just starting to work on writing in their district. She's the K-12 district coach. They're training with keys to literacy in a few weeks. She says they are starting with nothing. Where would you suggest I focus my time in different grade levels?
Okay, so when you say you're starting with nothing, I'm assuming that some writing must be going on. I'm hoping that some writing's going on.
This is me. Do you care if I just talk real
Yeah,
quick?
yeah,
Okay.
it'd be fine.
So some writing is going on. Yes. It's never been cohesive. We have some people doing races, some people doing tide, some people doing I don't know what. There is not a lot of explicit and systematic instruction going on at the moment. We've been focusing on reading the last few years and trying to get that turned around. So we're having a K-12 initiative, I guess we'll call that, of getting some solid writing practices, common language, common practices on board. So I'm a jump person, but I know all my colleagues are not. So
Okay. No, and that's good. That helps in terms of the response. I actually was doing a presentation in Breckenridge this last week, and it was one that I shared, half the time I presented, and then somebody from Douglas County presented, and they've taken self-regulated strategy development, and they're implementing it in their school systems pretty widely. And so one of the things is just to emphasize, it takes time. It's a work in progress. It's not like one year you start and you're done because, new people come into the system. Not everybody's going to be on board with it. They also did something that they provided, sometimes we force people into situations and they're resistant to it. So when you look at really large scale studies in reading or writing, often the effects are not very promising versus smaller studies. And I think it's because, a district will say everybody's now got to do this. So they did something I like too. They provided choice in terms of who went in, and then those people who went into the program, and felt successful became the best spokespersons for them. A lot of people, what she was saying, I think they were in a second or third year, started coming in voluntarily wanting to do this and getting preparation in. And I'm not saying self-regulated strategy development's your starting point. That was what they decided. I think, there's multiple things. I mean, one, you want students to be writing. If they're not doing that, they need to do that. I think for the first three grades, you need to be sure handwriting and spelling are being taught. I think that's really essential.
we do
Uh,
have that covered now for,
Okay, so
yeah.
that's great. I think I'd love to say, if I had to pick between sentence construction, handwriting, spelling, I'd get handwriting and spelling in there, in terms of kind of layering stuff in. I would also encourage that at each of the grade levels, as they're planning and doing stuff, that you teach strategies for, at a minimum, for planning. You know, to be quite frank, revising's effects are not that strong until you're middle school or high school, unless there's pretty good instruction provided. So, if I had to pick between planning and revising, I'm not saying I don't want you to have them revise, but I think I would place a little bit more emphasis on strategies for planning, and then maybe a general strategy, kind of like I was talking about before, for revising. I would also, I'm going to say two other things. With your science, social studies, etc., whatever is being taught there, getting writing or in reading, and you're going to see this more in basal series now. I guarantee you're going to see knowledge building and writing, reading connections, using writing to support reading, etc. The more you can get your science, social studies, and math teachers to do this, the better. That'll help not just with writing, but learning. And then the thing that's a challenge is, the first thing that you started with, we're doing different things at different grade levels, and sometimes within the same grade level. And so, you can't bring everybody together at once, right? You can't bring K to 12 together to design, but you can bring your science teachers, your social studies teachers in the upper grades together, and you can bring your primary grade teachers and et cetera together, and at least have a cohesive program through those, and then work on making it cohesive throughout. If the person who presented with in Douglas County, there was just an article in the Hechinger report, I believe, on this. But if you email me, I'll connect you with her, and she may, she's on the ground doing this. She would be even a better person to ask about this than I would. So my email is really easy. It's just steve.graham@asu.edu. And I think I'll also send you it's the same part that I presented, but shorter, but what they're saying they're doing in their county. But I'm sure she'd be glad to talk to you, and I would be really stunned if she doesn't have great ideas.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Can I jump in on what she was talking about? I was the one who asked about the sixth grader. I'm
Okay.
from Louisiana. The sixth grader basically missed some instruction in ELA fourth grade and fifth grade. There was a teacher shortage. And he's very bright. He's ADHD. He did not come out as far as needing any accommodations according to the test that was given from our district. So he can't use any keyboarding, none of those items. So I guess I'm just trying to figure out where do I start or where do I go? He's already discouraged as far as writing and just doesn't like it. He struggled with reading, but we finally have him reading well, but it's just the spelling and the writing transcription.
So it's the transcription skills in general.
Yes.
Okay. So I think one of the things on the transcription skills, one of the things that, I'm putting on, I was a special education teacher, and most of my career I've worked in special education departments. So I'm going to put my special education hat on for a second and try to think about identifying places where you might be able to enhance what he's doing. But I'm going to say this on the handwriting end. This is a tough uphill battle. So one of the things you could do is ask him to write the letters of the alphabet for you, just the lowercase ones, because those are the ones that are going to occur, and look to see how he forms those letters. So there may be some, you could concentrate some instruction on reformatting how letters are done. Now, I say this and I say it with some trepidation because once a motor pattern is established, it's really difficult to change it, especially if it's been going on for 5 or 6 years. But you might look and you might see there's 4 or 5 or 6 letters that really are slowing him up, like the U that I gave with my daughter. Does he write manuscript, cursive, or a combination of the two?
A combination. He writes manuscript now. I just started working with cursive writing for him during intervention, which he's excited about.
Okay.
And I'm hoping that helps with him keeping his pencil down on the paper and, allow it to flow because he has trouble with spacing also.
So there's a little bit of research that suggests that, if a kid is in manuscript and really slow or a lot of legibility problems, that switching to a different, like cursive or italics, I think cursive, given that you're on that route, would be a good idea.
Okay.
Um, in terms of the spelling, it's a slow slog. What I would encourage is that if you have the time to do this, is that you basically work on common spelling patterns. And so if you email me, I'll send you. Now, this is for younger kids that we did this, but some of this might work for you. I'll send you a manual that we did where we use word sorting activities and practice so that kids learn the most common words that they're likely to use in their writing. If you learn about 800 words, it counts for about 80% of the words you use when you write. So if you learn to spell those pretty quickly, but it's even more powerful if you can group those together in like let's say a weekly lesson where you have two contrasting patterns. Okay, like the CK sound at the end of the word. Now, I don't know where he's spelling at, but it might give you some ideas, or at least having that word list. We developed that out of a list of 10 million words that kids use in their writing. I'll never do something like that again. But, we were able to identify words that kids commonly use. And there's like this point of diminishing return. So at about 1,000 words, you're up to about 90% of the words that kids use when they write. And then, to get to 99%, you have to add like 10,000 more words. So nobody's going to teach that many words. But at least that 800, I think, 800, 850 provides a safety net. So it may be something you could work on. So if you send me an email, I'll send a couple of different things, and you can always recontact me if you want to talk about it.
Okay. Thank you so
You
much.
bet.
All right, we want to thank you, Dr. Graham. This is a very interesting presentation full of lots of good information. We've had 3 really great presentations so far, and we're looking forward to next Tuesday at 10 a.m. And we will hear from Nancy Eberhardt and Margie Gillis on syntax, which will close out the series. And then I think, and then the recording, I did put this in the chat, but the recordings will be available probably sometime next week on our website. It's got there a tab says Vermont Professional Resources, and there's a video section in there. So if you want to rewatch or tell your friends about any of the presentations if they want to watch them. So thank you very much again, and thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks for sharing some time. Have a good afternoon.